Just as the officers began to guide Robert toward the wide exit doors of the hall, the southern entrance cracked open with a gust of cold wind. The sound of the ornate hinges creaking was not loud, but in that moment, it was unmistakable. The room, already tense from the disturbance, turned as if on cue. A figure entered, cutting clean lines through the thick stillness like a knife through old velvet. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a bearing shaped by years of command, not just learned but worn like a second skin. His uniform was impeccable, dark blue fabric trimmed with silver, polished metals catching the overhead lights. On each shoulder, 4 silver stars gleamed like quiet declarations of power. General Clayton Ross didn't look left or right. He walked straight toward the center of the room, toward the man being mishandled by security, his boots tapping out a slow and deliberate cadence that seemed to echo deeper than any siren or command. He moved like someone returning to a battlefield, not with fear, but with unshakable clarity. His gaze was set, unwavering, as if he had rehearsed this moment in silence for years. People parted before him, not out of courtesy, but instinct. Authority has a soundless voice. When it enters a room, the atmosphere adjusts itself. The 2 officers, still gripping Robert's arms with the unkind urgency of those enforcing rules without understanding them, stiffened. One of them, younger, turned pale beneath his collar. The older one blinked hard and subtly loosened his grip. They weren't sure yet what was happening, but something had shifted. The temperature, the gravity, the invisible current in the room, it had all changed. Without speaking, the general stopped just 2 feet in front of Robert. Then, with a movement so exact it seemed part of a ceremony, he brought his heels together, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a crisp salute. The salute did not tremble. It did not rush. It was the kind of salute reserved for the flag at sunset, for a casket draped in stars, for a man remembered long after everyone else has forgotten. He held the salute without a word. And in that long, suspended second, the chaos dissolved. The phones that had been raised slowly lowered. A woman near the back sat down quietly. A teenage boy slipped his phone into his pocket. Even the overhead lights seemed to dim as the air stilled. The room had fallen into a kind of reverence, though no one had been told to feel it. It simply arrived, like a memory too heavy to ignore. Robert's body, worn thin by age and pain, tried to straighten. His left leg ached violently, the old injury now flaring with sharp insistence, but he stood as tall as he could, his hand tightening around the strap of his canvas shoulder bag. He looked at the general, not with confusion, but with a searching kind of recognition. The jawline, the slight scar over the brow, the way he held himself as if the world still needed defending, it all began to make sense. Slowly, a name rose from somewhere deep in the quiet places of his memory. A mission. A voice crying for help over a damaged radio. Blood. Smoke. Night. And then he knew. Ross. The pilot. But neither man said anything. The silence was full enough. A small girl in a blue dress, sitting cross-legged by the entrance with a tour group, whispered to her teacher, "Why is the soldier saluting the old man?" Her voice carried just far enough to be heard, and the teacher, who didn't know the answer, merely placed a hand over her heart and stood. Others began to stand too. Not by order, not by instruction, but by instinct. As if the act of witnessing something decent required people to rise. Even those who moments earlier had watched Robert's removal with cold detachment now found themselves shifted, uncomfortable in their passivity. The older officer finally took a step back. The younger one lowered his head. The general dropped his salute only after a long moment, his hand returning to his side with reverent control. He then turned slightly to face the small gathering, who now stood like churchgoers before an unknown sacrament. He spoke just one sentence, but his voice carried. "This man is Sergeant Robert J. Callahan." A murmur rippled through the group, some recognizing the name from the museum's own exhibit panels, others simply sensing that this was a name they would now remember. Robert remained still. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't weep. He didn't protest what had been done. He just stood there, like a tree that had withstood every storm and still cast shade. A museum docent, pale with embarrassment, approached quickly with a name badge and a printed event program. But General Ross gently raised his hand, not in command, but in pause. "There'll be time for that," he said. "But not now." And so, in a hall once built for steel and steam and now filled with quiet, a veteran stood before his country once again, not to be removed, not to be recorded, but simply to be seen. The wind outside tugged gently at the tall doors. And the room breathed. The moment held longer than anyone expected. Though nothing more was said aloud, everyone present sensed they had witnessed something sacred, something not meant to be captured on screens, but etched instead into memory. A museum aide gestured toward a reserved seating area with silver name cards arranged in stiff rows, but the general shook his head. Instead, he stepped beside Robert and gently placed a hand under his elbow, not out of pity, but as one comrade steadying another. The two men walked slowly, side by side, toward the main exhibit hall. The crowd moved aside without prompting. No commands were given, but a kind of silent order had taken hold. Visitors, staff, even those who had stood idle just minutes before, turned to watch the procession not as spectators, but as witnesses. They passed under the great bronze arch bearing the words "Freedom Owed, Freedom Earned." Inside, Robert's steps grew more careful. The limp in his left leg worsened, and the polished floor didn't help. Still, he didn't ask for rest. Not when every step brought them closer to the photographs and names he had known once in youth, names that had lived longer in his memory than they had on this earth. The general guided him to a quiet alcove on the left side of the gallery. It was smaller than the main exhibition, but more at *mate, tall glass cases, decommissioned WE*P*NS, flight helmets, and folded flags under warm amber lighting. At the center stood a black and white photo blown up to nearly life-size. It showed a squadron of young men standing beside a downed reconnaissance aircraft, grinning despite torn uniforms and smudged faces. Underneath, the caption read, "Rescue Unit, 12th Tactical, Seoul, March 1953. Robert's hand moved toward it involuntarily. His fingers hovered just above the glass, trembling slightly, stopping at the edge of a young face near the back row. "I remember," he whispered to himself, though the words never passed his lips. "Not really." General Ross took a slow breath. "That's the day I lived," he said, just loud enough for Robert to hear. In that old photo, second from the right, a much younger Ross stood with one arm around the shoulders of another man, his rescuer. The grin he wore then hadn't been seen on him in decades. The exhibit had been built years earlier, but until the previous month, Ross had never known the name of the man who had carried him through fire and chaos. The mission report had been redacted under military secrecy, sealed in archives until someone, and in turn doing a records audit, linked the details to a surviving service ID number. Robert's number. The file had included photographs, service logs, and a single line in an old field memo, "Against orders, Sergeant Callahan returned to retrieve downed airmen." Both survived. That single line had changed the course of Ross's life. And now, 70 years later, he could finally meet the man who wrote it with his actions. They stood together in front of that image in silence, two timelines folding into one. The exhibit crowd grew behind them, murmurs beginning to swell, but General Ross raised a hand gently and addressed the museum's curator, who had now appeared at the edge of the alcove with a microphone in hand. "Not here," he said softly. "Not for speeches." He turned instead to Robert. "You dragged me through 9 hours of shelling. Over a minefield. I never even said thank you." Robert blinked slowly. Then, at last, he replied, voice hoarse but firm. "You lived. That's enough." Ross nodded, his eyes glassing over. But he didn't look away. Later that day, the museum staff reviewed old footage from their archives. Hidden among thousands of feet of microfilm and magnetic tape was a silent video reel, black and white, shaky, but still intact. It showed a dust-covered Jeep pulling into an Allied base. A stretcher balanced across the back. On it, a bloodied young pilot, barely conscious. And behind the wheel, a figure slumped with exhaustion, bandaged across the chest, left arm immobile. It was Robert. The footage, once overlooked, was now moved to the museum's digital display. A new plaque was printed, mounted next to the blown-up photo. He returned when no one else did. Outside the museum, the wind picked up again. Tourists lingered near the gates. Some had arrived late, unsure of what had happened but sensing they had missed something rare. Inside, the small crowd had grown. A boy stood near the front with his grandfather, asking softly, "Who is that man?" The grandfather didn't know his name yet, but he replied anyway. He's someone who remembered others when it would have been easier to forget. In a forgotten hallway just off the main exhibit, a janitor paused to replace a paper towel roll. He leaned against his cart, staring at the display from a distance. He, too, had served, though no one at the museum knew. He looked at Robert and then down at his hands. Then he saluted, quietly, without anyone seeing. And Robert, though facing away, seemed to feel it. He turned his head just slightly, his tired eyes sweeping the room. And for the first time in many years, he did not feel like a ghost. The moment had ended, but its aftershocks were only beginning. That night, footage from the Savannah Union Station began circulating online. It started with a grainy clip from a teenager's phone, showing an elderly man being grabbed by the arms and led toward the exit. The video was shaky, the sound distant, but then, it captured something unmistakable. The camera caught the moment the doors opened. It caught the instant a four-star general walked into frame and stood rigid in salute, blocking the officer's mid-step. The teenager uploaded it with a simple caption: "Security was dragging him out of the station, until a general stood at attention." The clip spread fast. Within hours, it made its way onto veteran forums, local news, and military pages. By morning, it was on national broadcasts. The image, an old man in a faded jacket, a bag clutched to his chest, standing before one of the highest-ranking officers in the country, became a symbol, shared with hashtags like #SaluteTheQuietOnes and #ForgottenNoMore. Comment sections filled with disbelief, then with anger. Why was he treated like that? This man is a national treasure. My grandfather served in Korea. He died in a shelter. I wish someone had seen him too. The museum's social media accounts were inundated. Statements were issued. Apologies drafted. The director of the Savannah Memorial released a video the next morning, voice tight, eyes tired. "We regret the events that occurred yesterday. We failed to recognize one of our own. Sergeant Callahan's contributions during the Korean War are being formally acknowledged, and appropriate steps are being taken." But the apology was too late to contain the flood. Commentators demanded accountability. News anchors replayed the footage, their voices trembling with a mix of shame and reverence. Interviews with retired veterans surfaced, many recalling Robert's name, though they hadn't seen him in decades. Meanwhile, Robert remained silent. He returned home to his small cottage on the edge of Savannah, where a cluttered garden pressed up against a crooked picket fence. The old flagpole still stood in the front yard, though the rope had frayed from disuse. Inside, sunlight filtered through lace curtains onto a wooden table scattered with grocery receipts, pill bottles, and a single pair of worn reading glasses. He did not speak to journalists. He refused every invitation from talk shows, politicians, even military podcasts. His phone rang for days. He unplugged it. Because for Robert, the story had never been about him. He'd gone to the museum to honor others, to sit quietly among photographs of boys who never got old, to remember a war most had forgotten. He didn't want cameras. He didn't want apologies crafted in conference rooms. He wanted dignity, and perhaps a little silence. But silence, this time, wasn't what the world offered him. At the coffee shop near his house, strangers paid for his order without speaking. At the pharmacy, the clerk added a handwritten note: "Thank you for your service. I'm so sorry it took so long." And at his door one morning, he found a package wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside, a frame, it held a still image from the viral video, General Ross, hand raised in salute, and Robert, standing tall despite the pain. Below it, a small brass plate read, "When honor remembers, the world changes." He didn't hang it. He placed it face down in a drawer. But he didn't throw it away. At the museum, the aftermath deepened. The two officers who had removed him were placed on leave pending review. Staff members were required to attend sensitivity and history seminars. And an emergency meeting was held by the board of directors. Still, the backlash was never just about Robert. It was about every forgotten name engraved on the marble walls of public buildings. Every veteran who came home to silence. Every old man or woman passed over in grocery aisles, libraries, waiting rooms. In New York, a group of veterans gathered at City Hall, holding photographs of their own forgotten heroes. In Denver, a high school history class recreated the moment for a school assembly, one student dressed in a denim jacket, another in a borrowed ROTC uniform. In Los Angeles, a mural appeared overnight, an elderly figure seated on a bench, shadowed by rows of ghostly soldiers. The words above it read, "We never stopped standing at attention. You just stopped looking." And still, Robert said nothing. But that didn't mean the story stopped. Because somewhere along the way, people began asking who exactly he had helped. What had he done that made a general halt mid-stride and offer silent reverence in the middle of a public building? The answer, when it came, was quietly devastating. A newly declassified report circulated online. It detailed a high-risk mission from March 1953. A downed airman, bleeding out in the cold. Enemy fire, unclear terrain, a rescue order denied by command due to the danger. And one man, wounded, undersupplied, who had gone anyway. It was signed, briefly, by a young officer at the time, Lieutenant Clayton Ross. "I do not recommend pursuing recovery," the document had read. "But Sergeant Callahan has already gone." People read it in stunned silence. It was not just that Robert had saved someone. It was that he had done it alone. No medals. No cameras. No mission clearance. He had simply chosen not to leave someone behind. And for the first time in decades, his country finally caught up. 1 week after the ceremony at the Savannah Union Station, Robert received a letter unlike any he had ever seen. It came in a thick cream envelope, the return address bearing only the golden seal of the United States Senate. Inside was a single page, an invitation, not to a televised gala or a military parade, but to a private gathering in Washington, D.C. There would be no media. No applause. No news crews waiting at the steps of the Capitol. It would be held in the Senate's inner courtyard, a place reserved for moments that were meant to be remembered, not advertised. Robert considered declining. He'd had his fill of attention. But something about the tone of the letter, quiet, formal, sincere, moved him. And the signature at the bottom sealed it. Clayton Ross, General, retired. He arrived wearing the same denim jacket, freshly washed but still worn at the seams. A local Veterans Association had arranged transportation, but he insisted on carrying his own bag. Inside were the same yellowed letters, photographs, and one small medal he never displayed. The courtyard was quiet, shaded by tall trees and walled off from the noise of the city. Chairs had been placed in a careful circle, not a stage, not a spotlight, just a space of equals. Around him sat veterans, medics, pilots, men and women he hadn't seen in decades. Some walked with canes, others with assistants. All of them had come for one reason. Not to be recognized, but to recognize. The event began without introduction. General Ross stood at the center of the circle, not as a commander, but as a witness. He told them the story, not just of a daring rescue, but of the years that followed. How that act, on a frozen night in 1953, gave him a future. A career. A wife. Children. Decades of service that would have never existed without the decision of one man to return, wounded and alone, into fire. There was no podium. No cameras. Only tears that no one tried to hide. When the time came, a small box was presented. It contained the Gold Star for Valor, an award that had been delayed not by oversight, but by secrecy. The mission had been classified for so long that by the time it surfaced, history had already moved on. Now, history had returned. As Robert stood, everyone else rose with him. Old friends. Young officers. Men in wheelchairs. Women with folded flags pinned to their coats. No one was ordered to salute. But they all did. Not out of protocol. Not out of obligation. Out of truth. Out of debt. Afterward, Ross handed him a letter. Just one sheet of paper. Written in the general's own hand, the ink slightly smudged near the signature. Robert folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He didn't read it right away. That night, in his modest hotel room overlooking the Potomac, he opened it slowly. It was brief. Thoughtful. And the final words read, "You taught me, without a word, that the truest honor is choosing to return when everyone else runs away." He read it once. Then again. Then tucked it beside the old photograph of his unit in Korea. Robert returned to Savannah 2 days later. Life, for the most part, went on. He still walked to the corner store each morning. Still sat on his porch in the evening light, sipping weak coffee from the same chipped mug. Still watched the birds gather on the power lines before dusk. But the world had changed in quiet, subtle ways. At the Savannah Memorial Museum, a simple bench appeared near the central hall. It was wood, not metal, and slightly curved for comfort. The plaque beneath it read, "For those never properly thanked." Visitors often sat there without knowing the story. But somehow, they stayed a little longer. Quiet lingered there differently, as if even the air had learned patience. 3 colleges in Georgia began offering new scholarships, not for grades or athletic SK*LL, but for verified acts of courage and selflessness. They were named the Callahan Fellowships. Their purpose was simple, to support those who act when no one is watching. Robert never attended the unveiling. But he read about it. Quietly. Alone. He did raise a new flagpole, though. It appeared one morning in his yard, sturdy, tall, clean. A neighbor helped install it, and from that day on, Robert raised and lowered the flag each sunrise and sunset with the same precision he'd learned 70 years earlier. In his kitchen drawer, beside grocery lists and pill bottles, he kept only one letter. Not from the Senate. Not from the museum. The letter from General Ross. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, he would take it out and reread the final sentence. It didn't make him weep. Not anymore. It made him steady. It reminded him that though his deeds had once been forgotten, their echoes never were. And when people asked about the man who changed everything without ever asking for anything, locals would tell them. He walked quietly. But the world is quieter now when he is not around. And one day, a schoolchild might visit that museum bench and ask why the plaque says what it does. And maybe, if they're lucky, someone will answer. Because some people save lives not with P***NS, but with choices. Because sometimes, the greatest kind of courage is to walk back into the fire when no one's watching. Because kindness without question is enough.